The sun rose over the African savanna, a massive crimson orb bleeding into the golden horizon. As the first light touched the Pride Lands, a call echoed across the plains, the ancient rhythmic cry of the circle of life. From the farthest reaches of the kingdom, animals began their pilgrimage. Giraffes galloped through the morning mist, herds of elephants moved with heavy grace, and birds filled the sky like confetti. They were all heading toward Pride Rock, the towering stone throne of the Lion Kings. At the peak of the rock stood Mufasa, a majestic lion with a golden mane that shimmered like fire. Beside him stood Rafiki, the wise, eccentric mandrill. In his arms, Rafiki held a small golden bundle, Simba, the newborn prince. The shaman cracked open a gourd, marking the cub's forehead with red juice, then sprinkled sand over him. With a sudden sweeping motion, Rafiki lifted Simba high above the cliff's edge. Below, the animals erupted in a deafening chorus of cheers, stomping their feet and bowing low. This was the dawn of a new era. However, not everyone celebrated. In the shadows of a dark cave beneath the rock, Mufasa's brother, Scar, toyed with a field mouse. Scar was thin, dark-maned, and bitter. He had been next in line for the throne until this hairball was born. When Zazu, the king's hornbill advisor, came to announce the king's arrival, Scar's resentment flickered like a dying ember. Mufasa confronted his brother, reminding him of his place, but the seeds of betrayal were already sown. The Pride Lands were peaceful, but a storm was brewing in the heart of the family. Simba's journey had begun, oblivious to the weight of the crown, or the shadows lurking in the corners of his bright, sun-drenched world.
Perhaps you shouldn't turn your back on me.
Simba grew quickly into a curious and headstrong cub. He saw the world as his playground and himself as its future master. One morning, Mufasa took Simba to the very top of Pride Rock. "Everything the light touches is our kingdom," Mufasa explained, his voice like rolling thunder. He taught Simba about the delicate balance of nature, the circle of life, where the predators eat the prey, but eventually become the grass that feeds the prey. Simba, however, was more interested in the shadowy place on the northern border. Mufasa warned him never to go there, but for a cub who just couldn't wait to be king, a warning felt like an invitation. Seeking excitement, Simba found his uncle Scar. With calculated cruelty, Scar accidentally let slip that the shadowy place was actually an elephant graveyard, a place only for the bravest lions. Falling for the trap, Simba grabbed his best friend, Nala, and managed to ditch their babysitter, Zazu. They ran until the grass turned to gray dust and the air grew cold. The graveyard was a nightmare of bleached bones and sulfurous steam. Before the cubs could explore, they were surrounded by 3 cackling hyenas, Shenzi, Bonsai, and Ed. The scavengers, who were secret allies of Scar, prepared to feast on the prince. Simba tried to roar, but only a tiny squeak came out. Just as the hyenas lunged, a massive shadow fell over the cubs. With a roar that shook the very ground, Mufasa arrived. He swiped the hyenas aside like they were kittens and led the cubs home in a heavy, disappointed silence. That night, under the starlight, Mufasa told Simba about the great kings of the past watching from the stars. "They will always be there to guide you," he promised, "and so will I."
Look down from those stars. They will always be there to guide you, and so will I.
While Mufasa and Simba bonded, Scar was deep in the bowels of the earth, surrounded by hundreds of hungry hyenas. He promised them a world where they would never go hungry again, a world where he was king. "Be prepared," he sang, his voice dripping with malice as the hyenas marched in terrifying unison. The plan was set. Mufasa and Simba had to die. A few days later, Scar lured Simba into a deep, narrow gorge, telling him to wait for a marvelous surprise from his father. As Simba practiced his roar, the ground began to vibrate. Above him, on the plateau, the hyenas signaled a massive herd of wildebeest. Thousands of panicked animals began to thunder down into the gorge like a river of hooves and horns. Simba ran for his life, his small paws barely keeping ahead of the stampede. Scar found Mufasa and cried out that Simba was trapped. Without a second thought, the king leaped into the chaos. He dodged stampeding beasts, snatched Simba from a falling branch, and placed him safely on a high ledge. But the effort took everything he had. Mufasa was swept back into the tide of wildebeest. With desperate strength, Mufasa leaped against the cliffside, digging his claws into the rock. He looked up and saw Scar standing at the top. "Scar, brother, help me!" Mufasa pleaded. Scar leaned down, his eyes cold and murderous. He dug his claws into Mufasa's paws and whispered, "Long live the king." With a shove, he sent Mufasa falling back into the dust. Simba watched in horror as his father disappeared. When the dust settled, the gorge was silent. Simba found his father's body and curled up under his lifeless paw, sobbing. Scar appeared through the haze, blaming Simba for the tragedy and telling him to run away and never return.
Simba ran until his legs gave out. He collapsed in the scorching heat of the desert, far beyond the borders of the Pride Lands. Vultures began to circle his limp body, but they were hissed away by two unlikely heroes, Timon, a fast-talking meerkat, and Pumbaa, a kind-hearted warthog. They took pity on the cub and dragged him to the shade of a lush jungle oasis. When Simba woke, he was broken and hopeless. "You gotta put your past behind you," Timon advised. He taught Simba a new philosophy, Hakuna Matata. It meant no worries. In this hidden paradise, there were no kings, no responsibilities, and no guilt. To survive, Simba had to give up his diet of meat and learn to eat slimy yet satisfying grubs. Days turned into months, and months into years. The golden cub grew into a massive lion with a thick mane, but his heart remained hidden behind the carefree mask Timon and Pumbaa had given him. They spent their days lounging under waterfalls and swinging from vines. Simba tried to forget his mother, his home, and the father he believed he had killed. But the stars still looked down on him every night. One evening, as the three friends lay in the grass looking at the sky, Simba mentioned the great kings of the past. Timon and Pumbaa laughed at the idea, thinking the stars were just fireflies stuck in the big bluish-black thing. Simba laughed along with them, but inside, the pain returned. He walked away from his friends and flopped down on a cliffside. A tuft of his mane broke off and floated away on the wind, traveling across the desert, over the plains, and into the hands of a very old, very surprised mandrill named Rafiki. Rafiki smelled the fur, his eyes widening with joy. "Simba? He's alive!" Back in the Pride Lands, the world had withered. Under Scar's rule, the hyenas had overhunted the herds and the rains had stopped. The land was a boneyard. One day, a desperate lioness ventured far into the jungle in search of food. She found Pumbaa and began to hunt him. Simba intervened, and as he wrestled the lioness, he recognized the fire in her eyes. "Nala?" he whispered. The reunion was joyful, but it quickly turned into a conflict. Nala told Simba of the desolation at home and begged him to return and take his place as king. "You're our only hope," she pleaded. But Simba, consumed by his secret guilt, refused. "I'm not the king," he snapped. They argued bitterly, and Simba stormed off into a dark field. There, he encountered Rafiki. The mandrill led Simba through a thicket to a shimmering pool of water. "Look down there," Rafiki commanded. At first, Simba only saw his own reflection. "That's not my father," he sighed. "Look harder," Rafiki insisted. As Simba stared, the reflection changed. His own features blurred into the majestic face of Mufasa. "He lives in you," Rafiki whispered. Suddenly, the sky split open. The clouds formed the massive, glowing shape of Mufasa. His voice echoed from the heavens, vibrating in Simba's very bones. "Simba, you have forgotten me!" Simba cried out. "No, how could I?" The spirit replied, "You have forgotten who you are, and so have forgotten me. Look inside yourself. You are more than what you have become. You must take your place in the circle of life." As the vision faded, Simba realized he couldn't run anymore. The past hurt, but as Rafiki famously said while swinging his stick, you can either run from it or learn from it.
Simba sprinted across the desert, the hot wind whipping through his mane. By the time he reached the border of the Pride Lands, Nala, Timon, and Pumbaa had caught up to him. They looked out at the wasteland that was once a paradise. It was a landscape of gray dust and lightning-scarred trees. "It's horrible, isn't it?" Nala whispered. Simba nodded, his resolve hardening. "I didn't want to believe it." They used Timon and Pumbaa as a live bait distraction to get past the hyena sentries. Simba slipped into the shadows of Pride Rock just as Scar was screaming for Simba's mother, Sarabi. Scar was furious that the lionesses weren't finding food, blaming their laziness for the famine. When Sarabi dared to compare him to Mufasa, Scar struck her. At that moment, a roar shook the earth. Simba stepped out of the shadows. For a terrifying second, Scar thought he was seeing a ghost. "Mufasa?" he stammered. "No, it's Simba," the prince replied, going to his mother's side. Scar quickly regained his composure. He knew he couldn't win a fair fight, so he played his last card. He began to back Simba toward the edge of the cliff, forcing him to admit his crime in front of the Pride. "Tell them who is responsible for Mufasa's death," Scar hissed. Simba, his voice trembling, looked at his mother and said, "I am." The lionesses gasped in horror. Scar pushed Simba further until the prince was dangling over the edge of Pride Rock, exactly where Mufasa had once hung. Lightning struck the dry brush below, igniting a ring of fire. As Simba struggled to hold on, Scar leaned in close, his yellow eyes gleaming. "Here's my little secret," he whispered. "I killed Mufasa."
Killed Mufasa.
The truth hit Simba like a physical blow. The guilt that had haunted him for years vanished, replaced by a white-hot rage. With a burst of strength, Simba lunged upward, pinning Scar to the ground. "Tell them the truth!" Simba roared. Scar tried to lie, but Simba's claws were at his throat. Finally, Scar choked out the confession for all the lionesses to hear. The battle erupted. The lionesses, led by Nala and Sarabi, charged the hyenas. Timon and Pumbaa joined the fray, using their own unique styles of combat to send the scavengers scattering. Rain began to pour, mixing with the smoke and fire to create a chaotic, hellish landscape. Simba chased Scar to the very top of Pride Rock. Cornered, Scar turned into a coward. He fell to his knees, blaming the hyenas for everything, calling them the real enemy. He didn't know that the hyenas were listening nearby. Simba looked at his uncle with pity. "Run away, Scar. Run away and never return." For a moment, it seemed Scar would go, but as Simba turned his back, Scar lunged one last time. They collided in a blur of fur and claws. They fought through the flames, but Simba was younger and stronger. With a powerful shove, he threw Scar off the cliff. Scar survived the fall, but he found himself surrounded by his friends, the hyenas. They had heard him call them the enemy. As the flames closed in, the hyenas moved in for their final meal. The usurper was gone. The fire began to wash away the soot and bones, the rain signaling the end of the long drought. The rain fell steadily, quenching the fires and soaking into the thirsty earth.
Simba descended from the peak and embraced his mother and Nala. The surviving lionesses gathered around the base of Pride Rock, their heads bowed in respect. Rafiki stepped forward, his eyes twinkling. He handed Simba the royal staff for a moment before gesturing toward the promontory. "It is time," he said simply. Simba began the long climb. Each step was heavy with the memory of his father, but he walked with a grace he had never known as a cub. He reached the edge of the rock, looking out over his scarred but healing kingdom. He took a deep breath, looking up at a break in the storm clouds. He heard a familiar, ghostly whisper, "Remember." Simba let out a roar that echoed across the plains, traveling for miles. It was answered by the roars of the lionesses below. The circle of life had been restored. Time passed, and the Pride Lands bloomed once more. The grass grew tall and green, and the great herds returned to the watering holes. Once again, the animals gathered at the foot of Pride Rock. Rafiki stood at the edge of the cliff, just as he had years before. He held up a new cub, the daughter of King Simba and Queen Nala. As the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the kingdom in gold, the animals cheered. Simba looked out at his people, knowing that while kings may fall, the sun always rises. The cycle was complete, and the future was bright. The king had returned, and the Pride Lands were home once again.